Hi, everyone. Welcome to Progress Reimagined. I'm Kathleen Chu, and this is our very first episode. I'm so excited to get it started with you all. So, what's this podcast all about? Well, we're going to dive into some big ideas. We're talking innovation, new tech, fresh ways to look at the economy, but always with people at the center of it all. For our first episode, we're jumping right in with a pretty bold question. What if we've been getting it all wrong when it comes to measuring progress? I mean, think about it. We're always hearing about economic growth, GDP, all that stuff. But is that really what matters most? What if we flip the script around and put humans first, not profits? So that's what we're exploring today. I don't know about you, but I can't wait to dig into this. Let's go. Joining us today is Amanda Janoo, Economics and Policy Lead at Wellbeing Economy Alliance, also known as WEALL. She's an economic policy expert with over a decade of experience working with governments and international development institutions around the world. Her work aims to build just and sustainable economies through goal-oriented participatory policy design processes. Prior to joining WEALL, Amanda worked for the United Nations and the African Development Bank as an industrial policy and structural transformation expert. Together, we'll be exploring alternative economic models that prioritize equality, while quality of life, sustainability, and social equity over financial gain. So thank you for joining us, Amanda.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Kathleen.
So let me start by asking the question, what is that one thing in your field that many people believe is true but doesn't hold up under scrutiny?
When it comes to the economy, I think the thing that a lot of people believe is that the economy is governed by its own natural laws, that it's some abstract force that happens out there beyond our control, when the reality is that we are the economy. The economy is just a word for the way we produce and provide for one another, and therefore we have the power and the responsibility to transform it in line with our values and goals.
Thank you. So if you could start by telling us about your journey and how you got where you are today.
It's always hard to know, like, what is that, moment where your passion or interest in a particular topic began. But I think for me, I've always had a passion for and a belief that, like, the purpose in life is to be happy and to be of service to others, and that you can't really do one without the other. Like, you can't really be happy unless you're helping other people, and you can't really help other people unless you're happy. And I think that sort of always led me to look at the world and see a lot of different overlapping and interconnected challenges or crises that we face, whether it's environmental or social or political, spiritual, cultural, etc. And I felt like somewhere towards the center sat the economy. And if we could change that system, it could really ripple out and improve so many other aspects of life. And so I started to get really interested in trying to understand the economy, and pretty quickly realized that at least the types of econ classes I was taking in the US didn't make any sense to me. They didn't align with my understanding of the world or my identity also as a woman. I don't identify as an individualistic, rational, competitive person. And so I tried to understand where these ideas came from, and also try to find other types of schools of thought, like whether that's feminist economics or ecological economics, institutional economics, and many more. But for me, it was less about understanding, like, the theory of the economy as how do you actually go about changing it. And when I was really, coming into my professional space, like, neoliberalism was really dominant still in the world. So this sort of idea that government should take a hands-off approach to the economy and just allow for big private corporations or financial systems to sort of mold and direct our lives and destinies in line with its sort of tenets. And so I worked in industrial policy for quite a long time, because that was sort of the last bastion against neoliberalism, it felt like, where governments were supposed to proactively transform the structures of their economies through actively protecting and promoting certain economic activities relative to others. And a lot of that work centered in just asking the question of, like, why? What are you really trying to achieve with your economic policy, to get a sense of their real development goals, whether that's poverty alleviation, inequality reduction, resiliency, peace, etc., so that you can understand which types of economic activities then you want to support and which you want to decline in order to get there. And that really led me to the Wellbeing Economy movement, because this was a whole community, a global movement that was really trying to redefine progress and reimagine and redesign our economic systems so that they were really fit for purpose for the things that matter most.
Thank you. It's interesting how you kind of was pretty much thinking outside of the box. I suppose majority of us would just kind of learn in school, just take things that are in textbook as the way it is. So could you elaborate a little bit about how what you have learned didn't really align with your ideal way of, your thinking?
Yeah. I mean, in that regard, I should definitely mention I was homeschooled as a kid. Yeah,
I
so I didn't
see.
go into public school until I was about like 11 or 12. And I do think that that probably was quite influential in my confidence to maybe think outside the box or to challenge things, because a lot of my early education was really centered in self-exploration and a love of learning. I'm really genuinely expressing things I was interested in learning and being able to have the space to explore those. And so when I entered in and started taking Econ 101, first of all, I felt like there were so many of these assumptions that were baked in that were really being masked by like a quantitative methodology. So you just like weren't supposed to even question some of the assumptions that were underneath these like regression models or etc. And a lot of it, yeah, came down to this, first of all, the overriding view of the economics as a discipline about being how do we ensure that we meet everybody's unlimited wants within a system of scarcity. And it's like, well, that's impossible, right?
Right.
First of all, right? That seems like a challenging, at least, and maybe not the major point. Like, it felt like there needed to be a broader purpose to the economy, in whether or not that be ensuring that everybody has their basic needs sort of met, that there isn't huge levels of precarity or feelings of threat, that those needs are going to be diminished. But those kind of questions seemed often very secondary, that was relegated to a political sphere or to a social sphere, and that was not really the relevant domain of economics. And that's not true when we look at the history of economic thought. Like, many economists were thinking about that, but I think within the time frame that I was learning about economics, there was pretty strong like conventional wisdom and these certain ideas around, yeah, our selfishness as being the major driving force within this economic system, and that's somehow a good thing, right? That we're all selfish people, and that through our selfishness, we will somehow improve everybody's quality of life, which doesn't make sense, right? Like, any
Right.
child will get that everybody taking as much as they can for themselves is not going to leave everybody better off. But that's really like a core assumption in a lot of the sort of neoclassical economics that we end up learning. And so those kind of things, I just felt, I tried to understand where those ideas came from. And I think that was really helpful. They stopped teaching history of economic thought in most universities in like the 90s. And so I had to find books that were just written about, who are these old white dudes coming up with these ideas. And when you understand them in historical context, it does make sense, right? And that's like fair
Right.
enough. But once they all become baked in to these models that you're not supposed to even really question, then, I felt like it was important to unpack that a bit. And I think what was profound was that I was also studying economics right before and then, working after the global financial crisis. And that was a moment when so much of mainstream or like conventional economic thinking was really challenged, and a lot of space for heterodox economists who had previously been sort of like standing in a field talking amongst themselves were invited into the conversation. And people were really yearning for different kinds of understandings of what the economy is and what its purpose is, and how it can be redesigned in order to be more stable, at the very least, more equitable, ideally, and increasingly more sustainable in the face of climate change and ecological crisis.
I believe one of the economists, was it either at the IMF or I think it was at the IMF, recently published a paper kind of opposed, saying that some of the economic assumptions were made without without really proving that it's indeed fact. So that was very interesting to me. So that goes back to precisely what you mentioned, and you were able to figure that out when you were where you were in school. That's really amazing.
Yeah. I mean, that was incredible, actually. It's like, when you have a Nobel Prize, like the IMF publishing an article by a Nobel Prize
Yes.
winning economist about the fundamental flaws in mainstream economic thinking, that we're sort of like making some progress. But I think it's also a really beautiful and wonderful reflection. I always have so much time for people who are willing to change their minds, right? Like who are not so dogmatic in their particular ideology, to not see that maybe the way the world is, or the ways in which these assumptions are manifesting, might be false, And so, yeah, it's a beautiful, and it's also a challenging time to be alive, because yeah, paradigms are shifting. And I think one of the interesting things is when, historians talk about paradigm shift, it's a painful process, and it includes a lot of questioning established truths, established authorities, our own identities, our own purpose, right? And that whole process is really
Yes.
painful, but it's necessary to make space for new types of understanding, and yeah, initiatives to come.
So I think it's probably a good time to kind of dive into the Wellbeing Economy Alliance and what is that all about. If you can share a little bit about that, and also what exactly is a well-being economy, and how do you see it working in the future?
Sure. So the Wellbeing Economy Alliance emerged about 5, 6 years ago as a coming together of a lot of different, we call like new economic or heterodox economists, people who were representative of a lot of different schools of thought. So whether that's the care economy, donut economics, post-growth, degrowth, and many others, who recognized that what was needed was not like a perfect alternative model or a think tank, but really a movement building organization that could act as a picnic blanket for a lot of these different concepts, but also to invite in a much wider range of actors. So whether that's organizations trying to combat climate change, or working on racial equity or gender equity, or mental health, or many other types of like dimensions, who recognize or are feeling frustrated that they're just dealing with symptoms, and want to move upstream to looking at the economic system that is driving and perpetuating those crises. And then to invite in, policymakers and activists and artists and change makers, whoever really resonates with this idea, I think at its heart, that we have to stop treating people on planet like they're here to serve the economy, and start treating the economy like it's here to serve us. And so WEALL has, it's a global collaboration of a lot of different actors. And we sometimes describe ourselves as, a connector between the layers and the players, so we try to be a glue that can build the power base that's needed to really meaningfully transform the economic system. There was a famous paper by a Harvard researcher. I'm not sure if this is just the United States, but she looked at a lot of social movements throughout history and found that you really just need 3.5% of the population to be actively engaged in any movement for it to achieve systemic transformation, right? And so how do we get that 3.5% of people, in a lot of different areas, whether that's, in business or in advocacy organizations in government, in, civil society, to really engage in this transformative economic sort of initiative.
I think that's very interesting, because there are some countries that have already kind of adopted not just the GDP, but also a well-being kind of indicators to measure their success. And
Yeah.
and the organization has a big part to play in that,
Yeah.
making that a reality.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of definitely WEALL's claim to fame is helping. I should say that too. It was not just WEALL, but it was, many actors to help to build the Wellbeing Economy Governance Partnership. And that partnership is sort of an informal partnership, which is currently comprised of 6 countries. It's New Zealand, Iceland, Finland, Scotland, Wales, and Canada, who have all developed alternative indicators of progress to GDP, so that they're evaluating progress not just in terms of our level of economic growth, but by the level of sort of social and ecological well-being. And I think it's notable to just say that that partnership began with 3 countries that all had female heads of state at the time. And I don't think that's a coincidence, as I do think that part of this is representative of a larger sort of like, as I describe it, feminine paradigm shift in the world, where we're moving from really linear, mechanistic, hierarchical, materialist ways of thinking and doing, and trying to embrace more systemic, holistic, passionate, and inclusive like forms of governance and decision making. And that starts with really recentering our North Star of what are we trying to achieve? How are we evaluating progress in our societies? Because if we're evaluating it by our level of economic growth, we're just saying that we're succeeding if we're just producing as much as possible, regardless of whether or not that production is actually leading to improvements in people's quality of life. And this sort of flips that script and says, let's look at the quality of life as our definition of success, so that then we can think about if the ways and what we're producing is actually positively contributing to that and how.
What you mentioned about production is very interesting because I've seen, say, for example, when I go to the malls, which I don't usually go, but I see there's so many things that are being sold, and I kind of doubt they would ever be purchased. I don't know about you, but there are just tons and tons of stuff that we do not need. And I remember you mentioned something about, in terms of allocation of resources, what are the things that really matters to human beings and that are good for the planet? And what are the things that are we just going ahead and produce and just for the sake of growth?
Mm-hmm.
So that's, if you can share a little bit your views on that.
Yeah. I mean, that's really the heart of the question, right? And so, for example, I remember reading recently that I think we've produced enough clothing at this point for the next 8 generations. So, like we still continue to do a lot of fast fashion to sort of, and to build advertisement and marketing to sort of really encourage that mechanism of consumption, but to do it in a way which is really damaging to the planet and uses a lot of unethical labor, right? And so the energy which goes into that and the suffering that goes into producing these clothes that ultimately we don't really need right now, right? And also there are ways in which we could direct those energies, I think, towards the types of services and goods that are like really most critical for people. And so I often think about like food is the best, right? Because food is something that you don't only need to survive, but is one of the greatest joys of life. It connects us when we eat together. It is so tasty, and it like it's reflective of culture and holds so many other aspects into it. And it also happens to be a dimension where we know that regenerative agriculture, for example, we can produce food and heal the planet simultaneously. And so I think it's about really looking at holistically, not just in terms of like, what is the price of this? And therefore, what is the value of this? What is the value of food in much more expansive dimensions in terms of what it provides for our people and planet? And so then how can we produce it and ensure its provision in a way so everybody has enough and it's grown in a way that is regenerative and is still reflective of all of our unique cultures and encourages that connection in families and communities.
Right. That's kind of the challenge, isn't it? How do you how do you design a policy that can actually propel our kind of the path towards that future? Yeah, just curious. Because, well, everyone has their own kind of the way they see things. And it's hard for them to step back and look at the problem or the challenge holistically. So just curious how in your conversation with some of the governments, how do you kind of go about sharing that with them?
Yeah. So what I think is interesting is actually it feels much more daunting than it really is. I think we have the capacity and we have the knowledge that we need to do this kind of transformation. And so, For example, when I was working in industrial policy, again, I was mentioning it was really important to be clear on like what were they really trying to achieve. And so in Myanmar, for example, it was the first government I worked with that was also majority women in their Ministry of Economy. And their goal was urban rural inequality reduction. That was the really important thing. And they needed to develop a textile strategy. And the standard textile strategy is obviously let's attract in huge multinational corporations who will set up production for like fast fashion, export orientation. But because their goal was not export competitiveness or growth, it was rural urban inequality reduction, then it doesn't make sense to provide incentives for huge corporations who know how to consolidate wealth better than anyone. It was about how do we support rural informal firms? How do we support cooperatives and other types of enterprises that can ensure more equitable development? Similarly, like in Wales, who's one of the Wellbeing Economy governments, they went through a participatory process of asking their citizens, what kind of Wales do you want to leave for your children and grandchildren? And on that basis, they developed these 7 high-level well-being goals, which were around, equity and health and global responsibility, biodiversity, etc. And they went through a process of transforming their system of governance so that any policy needed to be assessed by its contribution to all of those 7 goals, right? And so in practice, what that meant was that when they wanted to build a new highway that went through a nature reserve, they had to make the case for how this was going to contribute to all of the 7 goals. And they couldn't make the case for contributing to any of the goals except for maybe one. And therefore ended up putting a freeze on any new highway development so that they could put that money into active travel and public transportation instead, which they could see as contributing to greater equity and health and global responsibility, et cetera, right? And so goals we set really matter because they become the framework by which to evaluate our economy success. And as long as we hold just economic goals, we'll always be evaluating the economy by its capacity to support itself, right?
Right.
And so I think I'm a huge believer in democracy, like in participatory deliberative process. And I think when you start with a social or environmental goal and you ask people what kinds of transformations are needed to achieve it, they understand that a lot of them are economic transformations. So in Ireland, for example, they just did a citizens assembly on biodiversity, right? And they recognize that so many, like if we're serious about not just protecting, but regenerating all of our species, like we need to have really different transformations in terms of our systems of production and are actually working on currently drafting a constitutional referendum around the rights of nature and to figure out how the rights of nature can ultimately actually be held as superior to the rights of property. Because it's like we've held on to the right of property so strongly that it trumps any other rights, whether that's human rights or environmental rights, etc. And like those kind of initiatives, I think, give us some hope that we can do it. As long as we're clear what we're trying to achieve, I think then we'll have clarity on what kind of economic transformations are needed to get there.
Right. So, I mean, this is probably kind of similar question to the one before, but say, I'm sure by now there'll be some critics who may be thinking that all sounds great, but how do we actually make it happen? You say it's easy, but it's, say, for someone who needs to, say, feed the family, it's hard to comprehend. So what would you say to people who are, doubting that there's actually a different path that we can take?
Yeah. And I mean, that's fair enough. I shouldn't say it's easy, right? But I do think that there's something intuitive in it. I think that actually a lot of the way that we currently structure our economy or even talk about our economy is much less intuitive. Yeah. Like you have to sort of try to wrap your head around it. And I think, it's fair enough to be, skeptical about, these types of transformations, especially when you're in a state of just trying to survive. And I think that's fair enough too. We have built a system where most people are in a state of extreme precarity. And so we just have to keep our heads down and try to survive. The issue is just that the increasing frequency and severity of the crises we're facing, whether that be, our environmental crisis, our inequality crisis, political crises, right? Like people have totally lost faith in government's capacity to do anything
Mm-hmm.
because it's seen as
Mm-hmm.
just like a henchman of this larger economic system. Or also the housing crisis, the cost of living crisis. All of these things are part of this, moment of transformation we're in. And so I think the point is whether we like it or not, like the system is changing. It's just a question of like, in what way do we want it to go? Because right now the system is transforming every day in a way that consolidates more and more wealth and power into fewer and fewer hands and is throwing off and destroying, right? Like creating huge
Right.
amounts of mass extinction of species and
Yes.
destabilizing our entire like environmental systems, right? So it's like our system is
Mm-hmm.
changing. The thing is, how do we want to be sort of engaged in that process of transformation and of redefining progress and of being an active participant in trying to develop different strategies in terms of where we want to go? And it's not given, right, that this is going to, the well-being economy is the way that we're going to go. I think we could equally go to much more authoritarian, sort of fascist, like just inward locking down kind of way in response to these crises too. So I once had a sociology professor, and I think it was my freshman year of college, who said, I don't envy you all because you live in a time of a Luke Skywalker versus Darth Vader sort of like period, and what you do will determine the fate of the world. And I don't
Mm-hmm.
love these binaries, right? Like I don't think it's just a binary of these two different options. But I do think we live in a unique moment where we will sort of determine the course of history. And that's a lot of pressure, but that's also incredible opportunity too.
That is so true. I can I completely resonate with what you said. Having two kids, it just thinking about their future and the future generation. I don't know if we will end up leaving the world a better place for them or not. So yeah, well, if you can tell me a little bit about some of the progress and just kind of maybe help us share some ways and lights on how we can get there to this different path.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I think a lot of the initial sort of like opening up of our minds as a result of the global financial crisis and being more open to different economic thinking. But then it's really been since COVID. It's been remarkable to see how rapidly this movement is growing. And I really want to emphasize that it's, this movement comes under a lot of different banners. So it's like circular economy, regenerative economy,
Mm-hmm.
solidarity economy, post-growth, etc. So it's not all just using the term well-being economy, but we have seen around the world such remarkable progress. And so I think I was mentioning to you, one really exciting development for me is the UN Special Rapporteur for Poverty Alleviation and Human Rights really being committed to advancing a post-growth agenda in the next iteration of the SDGs. So really challenging this assumption that economic growth is necessary for poverty alleviation, which I think is one of the foundational sort of ethical rationalizations for the current orientation towards growth. And then it's like, and then we'll figure out everything else afterwards, right? But it's like,
Right.
we've been achieving such exponential economic growth, but still the vast majority of people live in, like in poverty and in huge amounts of precarity around the world. So growth is not equating immediately to the
Right.
kind of poverty alleviation or equity or sustainability we want. And so he's building a whole group of different countries and networks to sort of advance this. We've also had last year the EU and the EU Parliament held a whole Beyond Growth conference to really reckon with like, what does this mean? And so then this year there have been Beyond Growth conferences happening in different countries within the EU. When India held the presidency for the G last year, they were advancing to the G20, right? Like the supposed winners of this whole system in terms of GDP per capita, right? That they needed to redefine progress away from GDP and towards well-being, and using that opportunity and that leverage to really advance a notion of an economy in service of life. We've been seeing, I think probably the most like these high level sort of political things, I think give us a lot of hope. And my background is obviously in policy, but probably the most transformative initiatives are happening locally. So they're happening at a city scale, at a community scale, at like a subnational scale. I was at an event in Costa Rica a few months ago, and I got to meet this amazing guy named Edgar Mora, and he was the mayor of the city Curabad in Costa Rica. And when he was mayor, he made all of the pollinators citizens, like butterflies and bees and hummingbirds, because once they were citizens, it meant that looking at the city, you would see that it was an archipelago because all these green spaces were disconnected, and it
Wow.
redefined infrastructure so that green spaces were now infrastructure, not just physical infrastructure. And so we're seeing people really like, I don't know, initiating, I think, pretty exciting transformations at the local level, which I think are seeping up and are permeating from the local to the global. And then, of course, just last month, there was the UN Summit of the Future, which was really exciting in terms, I mean, its ambition was to reimagine multilateralism, which we desperately need at this moment in time. Did it live up to that? That's a question, right? I don't think so. But it did include within this UN pact a commitment to move beyond GDP, commitment to sort of emphasizing and centering future generations, and a commitment to sort of transformation of the global financial architecture. And so the fact that that is, a pact which all countries have sort of signed on to in some way is very encouraging, that we're starting to recognize there are certain reforms needed at the global level to even make space for the self-determination we need at the local level.
I see. So how would you say, ideally, how do you see the global economy? How do you envision the world, say 5 years from now, in a good scenario, positive scenario, that the scenario that we want to see?
Yeah. So when we talk about the global economic system, I think that that's actually a really huge one, because the reality is that at least since the 1980s, we really haven't been trying to govern the global economic system at all. We've really allowed for multinational corporations and global finance to set the rules of
Right.
that realm. And so as a result, we have created legal institutions like, I don't know if you've ever come across the investor state dispute settlement system. Does not sound sexy, but it is one of the most messed up things, where it's a agreement that's put into all of our trade and bilateral investment treaties, which says that multinational corporations can sue governments for any law that they pass that may infringe on their future profit. I know.
Okay.
So it's like anti-democracy, right? Like it's
Right.
legitimate anti-democracy. So when Ecuador, because of mass protests, passed a law that prohibited mining in the Amazon, like for oil, an oil company sued them for the equivalent of their entire health budget for the right to say they didn't want to do that, right? And so we've allowed for them to really govern this realm. And so the reality is that, like, even though I work in policy, I actually really believe that this is about decentralizing power, empowering people to really have a voice again. And so it's not about like a world government, but I do think what we need to have is strategic interventions at the global level around antitrust legislation, right? Where you break up, like every single sector in the world now is dominated by less than 5 corporations, right? And so antitrust, I think one of the most positive developments of the last few years was this agreement around a global minimum tax standard. And so almost all countries have now agreed that no matter where a multinational corporation goes, they have to abide by a minimum like 15% taxation to stop this sort of race to the bottom. And I think that's a good sign that governments are recognizing that they need to start creating some rules at that level that are important to make space for national governments, let alone local communities, to have genuine autonomy over their economies and that decision making.
It's like back, I think it was 10 years ago, when the U.S. legislation recognized that corporates are people. They have the same rights. It's kind of similar, but in a maybe worse way.
So this is really interesting, actually. So I think what you're referencing was Citizens United, which was a legislation that was passed, which pretty much allowed for unlimited corporate financing of campaigns because of a constitutional recognition of corporations as people. But that actual recognition of corporations as people came from a very racist history, where when the 13th Amendment was passed, that recognized African Americans as 3/4 people, corporations lobbied and they said, well, if these things are going to be recognized as people, we should too. And at the time, it was persuasive enough that it was included in the amendment, right? And so the thing is, we're protecting that, even though it came from a very, very racist and messed up paradigm of a time period. And so I think this is why, history is always really important to read, right? To understand a little bit of where these things came from. Because again, in historical context, it can make sense. And so, and also history tends to repeat itself a lot too. And so I think there's a lot we can learn in history, but I also read history, honestly, sometimes when I'm feeling kind of bummed out, because when you read history, it's also like, it could be worse. Right. There's some, very messed up periods of history as well. And so this is something that I was never a historian, but I do have a lot of appreciation.
Right. So say by now, like for those who are listening and kind of agreeing with kind of what you said really resonate with them and they want to help, how do you recommend them to get involved and contribute?
Well, of course, I would encourage them to join the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. You can check us out at WEALL, WEALL.org, and join as a member, join the community. That's how I originally joined, was just as a voluntary member.
Okay.
Because it seemed like a really incredible initiative, and because I think you'll find other like-minded individuals from around the world, but also be able to connect with people who are in your country or location as well. We have hubs that are sort of building, because I think the transformations are not universal. They're going to be contextual to your place and your culture and your history and your geographies, etc. So coming together to really try to advance that different vision of progress, and then thinking about those economic transformations and those strategies. And so hubs take a lot of different strategies. Some are around narrative, right? Like, how do we really build the cultural paradigm that is needed to advance these different values, whether through art or music or also media. Some are really doing direct political advocacy to their governments. Others are really focused in education and awareness raising. I think whatever gifts that you have, what passions that you bring are critical to the movement. And so, would love you to join the WEALL family.
Thank you. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you think it's worth mentioning?
Goodness. Well, I could talk with you forever, honestly. That's a lovely conversation. I think we covered quite a bit, but would definitely be very keen to chat with you again.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amanda. It's a pleasure talking with you.
Oh, thank you so much, Kathleen. I really enjoyed it.
And with that, we conclude the first episode of Progress Reimagined. I want to thank you for joining me on this exciting new venture. Today, we've set the tone for what this podcast is all about, challenging long-held beliefs and exploring new ways to put humanity at the center of our progress. As we've discussed in this first episode, reimagine our economic priorities isn't just an academic exercise. It has real implications for our daily lives, our communities, and our future. By questioning the status quo and considering alternative models, we open up new possibilities for creating a world that truly serves human well-being. I hope this first conversation has sparked your interest and inspired you to think differently about progress and what it means for an economy to be truly successful. If this got you thinking, please share it with a friend or a colleague. Help us grow this community of forward thinkers. Remember, every small shift in perspective can lead to significant changes in how we shape our world. Your thoughts and actions matter in this ongoing journey of progress. So thank you for tuning in to the first episode of Progress in Reimagined. I'm Kathleen Chu, and I'm looking forward to continuing this journey with you. Until next time, keep questioning, keep innovating, keep putting humanity at the heart of progress.